Welcome back to my electronic chalkboard here. Notice the all-important, sadly empty cup of coffee. We just looked at supply coming from a production possibilities frontier. I want to add now demand and ask about equilibrium. Remember, I'd like you to get in the habit of just pulling out paper and drawing this over and over again, where whatever the two-dimensional slice that we're interested in has a corresponding kind of picture that captures the logic of economics to it. So in this case, if we're looking at the quantity of coconuts that Robinson Crusoe or someone else might be producing, and some price of coconuts, we had from the previous bit of logic that the relationship between production, price and quantity in production has to be upward sloping, the supply curve. We're going to have, from some further logic, the comparable idea that the demand curve is always downward sloping. So I'd like to start now with a hypothetical world in which there's different people here. Now, if it's Robinson Crusoe, it's just one person, and they themselves would be optimizing. But imagine that it's two people, just say Mr. and Mrs. Crusoe, and Mrs. Crusoe is the supplier. She makes coconuts, she grows them, she raises them, she climbs up trees and pulls them down, and Mr. Crusoe is the demander and consumes them with great gusto. So what we know from each of them is that Mrs. Crusoe, as it were, has an upward sloping supply curve. Mr. Crusoe has a downward sloping supply curve. In the textbook, you have the example of selling textbooks, used textbooks. There's many, many other examples. It doesn't make any difference. The logic is exactly the same, which is that if this person is an optimizer and this person is an optimizer, their interactions will be predictable in a certain way. We can predict the outcome of that interaction and call that an equilibrium, a balance, a trade-off between the one force and the other force, the supply and the demand. Remember, we're looking for predictions that might be drawn around the thing we observe and allow us to imagine that if we intervened in some way, we'd get a different outcome. So, for example, if we did some nutrition education to teach people that coconuts were actually better for you than you thought they would, then the demand curve would be different, because at every price level, they would demand more. Or perhaps you found out that coconuts were actually bad for you, and then the demand curve would shift, and we'd like to know how those changes would play out. That's what our exercise in logic is intended to do, is to produce a kind of thought experiment, a mental model, a mental laboratory in which we can conduct thought experiments and test hypotheses and make predictions that we can then test as hypotheses in the real world. So what is the prediction about the outcome here? You know where this story is going. You've seen this movie before, quite literally. So we imagine in our thought experiment that if Mr. Crusoe and Mrs. Crusoe here ended up at this quantity of coconuts for some reason, then the demand would be willing to pay, offering that price, and the supply, the production, would be, it would involve a trade-off only of that much lower cost of making of going to get the coconuts or producing the coconuts. And so if something is worth this amount, and it only costs this amount to produce, by golly, Mr. Crusoe here is going to say, well, I really like this. I'd like another one, please. And Mrs. Crusoe is going to say, oh, it's not that hard for me to make another one. If you'll give me that, I'll give you that. If you'll give me that, I'll give you that. If you'll give me that, I'll give you that. And they will walk towards the point where the last coconut is just equal to what it's worth to consumption, what it has cost in production. Remember, the cost in production is in terms of all the other things that aren't produced because of the coconut being produced. Likewise, on the consumption side, it's all the things that aren't consumed because of the coconut being consumed. And once you get past this point, the seller along the supply curve would say, oh, sorry, I have better things to do than make another coconut. And the demander along the demand curve would say, there's other things I want to consume more than consume another coconut. And so they would stop here. But notice one distinctive thing about our class on economics for food and nutrition is that food is almost always traded internationally. There are a few kinds of foods like fresh milk or lettuce that might not be traded very much, but most of the food that you see, like most goods you see, what happens in reality is for any given place, for example, if this is the United States and this is all coconuts in the United States, the rest of the world has some supply and demand for coconuts as well. We don't know what that is, but I can think about coconuts for just a few minutes and give a pretty good guess that if the United States were all by itself, our supply and demand curve for coconuts might cross about here. And if the rest of the world were all by itself, its supply and demand curves would cross, let's see, at the same price as the US? Probably not, because the rest of the world is quite different from the US. In particular, if I think about coconuts and the cost of making coconuts in terms of other things, I'm probably going to recognize pretty darn quick that the rest of the world is a heck of a lot more awash in coconuts than the United States. So the rest of the world, just Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America generally, potentially Africa, Asia, they've got coconuts coming out of their ears compared to us. Lots of tropical environments, lots of coastline where we might think coconuts would grow. And so they're going to have a cost of growing coconuts that's lower, that is a supply curve that's lower than ours. And they might have a demand curve for coconuts that's also perhaps lower than ours. The net result being that their price of coconuts out in the rest of the world is going to be somewhere down here. So this is going to be the price of coconuts in the rest of the world, such that our consumers can say, yippee, I can consume all the way out to here. Now, how does that work? Foreigners say, we'll sell you some coconuts at this price. Let's say this is, I don't know what coconuts cost in the supermarket nowadays. Maybe it's $3 a coconut. And foreigners say, we'll sell you another 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 million, however many coconuts they'll sell you. Consumers would say, yippee, let's buy them. And American consumers, remember this is the United States, would say, okay, we might have a total consumption of, say, 120 bazillion coconuts. I have no idea what it is. And then this American suppliers who are growing coconuts, say, in Hawaii or Florida, maybe in Louisiana, I don't know where they grow coconuts, but not in Massachusetts, they'd be saying, well, at this price, we only want to grow this many coconuts. And so they would grow perhaps 80. And the gap between these two, which in this case is 120 minus 80 or 40, this is the quantity that's traded. Now notice in this case demand is a larger number than supply, so we have a, quote, shortage, but that's actually imports, that quantity there. This quantity is the production, 80, so that is quantity produced. 120 is quantity consumed, and this here is quantity imported. Now notice that this set of points is the predicted equilibrium for a free trading country. This point here is not what we see, because foreigners on boats are willing to ship us plenty of coconuts at, say, in this case, $3. And what you'd observe around any supermarket is lots and lots of things labeled Costa Rica, Chile, wherever, And that's the situation that we're in. Now, some of those things in your supermarket are coming from Costa Rica or Chile or whatever, so they are clearly imported. But there are plenty of other things in our supermarkets that don't have that price for them either. Instead, what they have is a situation where American suppliers have foreigners who tell them, wow, we'd pay, this much for your whatever. So what is it that foreigners are willing to pay much more for than American consumers? Well, that would be wheat or pork or often poultry products, poultry meat. So if we're talking about wheat or corn or cotton, the supply for the U.S., if you go and buy wheat flour in the market, you'd be paying this price, a price up here. So you're only able to consume this much. And we have a situation where this is the quantity produced, this is the quantity consumed, and this is the quantity exported. Now, this is the equilibrium for an exported good. This is the predicted equilibrium for an imported good. And this thing here would be the equilibrium only for a good that's not traded. And what you see in the slides for this week 2 is all of the consequences of that kind of equilibrium in terms of how suppliers and demanders interact. The welfare consequences of that are shown in producer and consumer surplus, which is areas on the graph that we'll look at next.